I want to bring in David Jolly, former Republican congressman from Florida, where the president will be tonight, Eddie Glaude, professor at Princeton University, and John Della Volpe, polling director at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Congressman, I must go to you first. Sure. This is your state. Are you surprised that the president is making an immigration crackdown his primary focus? Is it a winning issue in Florida, which has a whole lot of immigrants?
It is not a winning issue, and 2018 showed us that, and we can talk about that in a second. But to Peter's earlier point, I think this is the president's very reflexive political behavior. You know, rarely have we seen a White House occupant who is so ready to grab at any political tool he can within his official capacity on a moment's notice to try to reset a narrative for his own political purposes. Presidents make policy clearly through a political lens and try to message that, but this president is very reflexive. Recall, you know, Peter referred to some of the stories around the election. Recall the stories of the caravans that never really manifested themselves in the way the administration warned. Sarah Sanders said there were thousands of terrorists embedded in these caravans that were coming into the United States just in time for Election Day. I think this, though, at the end of the day, Stephanie, if we see a mass deportation force and we see the stories around it, it will backfire on Donald Trump. 2018, you know, Nancy Pelosi says it was about policy. I agree somewhat. I'm not sure many voters could tell you what the Democratic policy platform was, but I do think it was a rejection of Donald Trump's policies. And front and center to that was kids in cages, family separations. If Donald Trump seriously thinks that we're going to show the nation that we're going to rip people out of their homes, out of their communities, and deport them, to encourage even more family separation, those suburban voters who went blue in 18, particularly women voters, moms, they're going to stick with Democrats in 2020, and Donald Trump's going to lose on this issue.
His own daughter and senior advisor, Ivanka Trump, who was one of his strongest surrogates on the campaign trail last time, called the zero-tolerance policy, the child separation, one of the lowest points in the administration. It will be interesting to see how she categorizes it now. It's no longer something in the past. Eddie, according to the Washington Post, supporters of the plan, including Stephen Miller, ICE Director Mark Morgan, and ICE Deputy Director Matthew Albence, have argued forcefully that a dramatic and highly publicized operation of this type will send a message to families that are in defiance of deportation orders and could act as a deterrent. But here's the thing. A highly publicized operation could mean these pictures of ICE agents arresting parents with children. That's terrible politically for the president. And we know when the president threatens to build the wall and completely shut down the border, that's when we see a massive influx of migrants trying to get in before they can.
So the first thing we have to do is dismiss Stephen Miller et al.'s claim that there is some kind of evidence that this will actually have that kind of effect. This is not an evidence-based policy. Let's just dismiss that out of hand. And secondly, what we need to do is to understand what is really motivating this, Stephanie, is cruelty. It's cruelty. What Donald Trump did yesterday, what he announced via Twitter, and this may sound hyperbolic to some folk, it was a terroristic act. Think about all of those mixed families, people who have parents who have kids, right? We know that he can't really implement this. That's what Julie Ansley just said, and Peter, that this was just a political ploy. But what is he doing? He's terrorizing families in communities who think that they're going to be snatched away from their kids, who have to walk around daily wondering whether an ICE agent is going to show up at work and snatch them, and then they won't have their family. So he's announcing his campaign. Instead of calling people rapists, right, he's announcing his campaign by enacting terror on families who are often really close and productive members of communities around this country. It's horrifying.
Because he thinks it works, because he's a salesman. John, you're my numbers guy. Yeah. You're our polling person. Do the majority of Americans, or even Republicans, support this idea?
No, Republicans are far more nuanced on this issue than I think Trump gives them credit for. Yes, about half, I think, of his base will get fired up in the rally tonight, but the other half, as I said, are much more nuanced. But more importantly than that, we talk so much about Trump's base and his election strategy. What we're not talking about, as Eddie just mentioned, is the fear and anxiety that is creating not just with those undocumented immigrants, but families and young people across America. The last survey that we conducted from Harvard's Institute of Politics in April showed that the average person has more stress and anxiety than joy in their life if they're young. I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk to 1,000 or so social workers and physicians recently. And as soon as I got off the stage, a young woman who's a school teacher said, "You're exactly right. Come to my school." I visited her school a couple miles from here. She said they don't have teacher conferences because the parents are afraid to show up because their kids are undocumented and they're afraid they're going to be picked up. I went to get a bottle of water at the 7-Eleven across the street. People looked at me like I was a G-man, right? It was shocking.
But is there a counter? And I'm not saying it's anyone at this table. Are there a large percentage of American voters who would hear that story and say, well, our education system is failing. We don't have enough good teachers for American kids. Maybe those kids shouldn't be there. I'm not saying I have that feeling, but I'm trying to get an idea of the numbers, the percentage of Americans who could hear your story and read something different.
The recent polling would indicate about 21 to 23%. There was a recent poll that came out within the last 2 or 3 weeks, which indicated, has Trump done too much, just about the right amount regarding immigration, or has he not gone far enough? And I think 21 to 23% said he has not gone far enough. So that would be essentially kind of the base of people who feel that way. Those are the folks who are lining up now, perhaps, right, to participate in the rally tonight.
Congressman, can you give us a little political strategy here? Who wants this to be a #1 issue besides a portion of the president's base? And when he does the Stephen Miller sweep and creates this show, it certainly makes a lot of news. But how is it news that helps him? Especially when Americans would tell you they've got health care issues, they've got economic issues, they don't have fast Wi-Fi.
Because there's electoral college math behind all of this. And listen, Florida is a must-win state for Donald Trump. If you look at the numbers that we've all seen coming out of the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and so forth, without Florida, there really is likely no path to re-election for Donald Trump. Florida is often referred now as a red state because Republicans continue to win statewide, but it really is 51-49. And the way you win a tight race like that is you have to have Republicans out there voting. Florida Republicans have essentially a supermajority in the state capitol. They just passed, and the Governor DeSantis signed a ban on sanctuary cities anywhere in the state of Florida. I expect we'll hear the president talk about that tonight. So Donald Trump is speaking to a very targeted electoral college math constituency, if you will. This is not going to be an issue that resonates in the suburbs of Virginia or New Jersey or other places.
But it doesn't
he will
need
lose
to.
because of this. But he doesn't need to win those places. He can write those off if he can win these red states.
That's a wow. Eddie wants to make a last point on this.
But it goes back to his internal polling. What did his internal polling say? He was losing Florida against Biden. So he thinks this.
But his internal polling isn't looking at the Electoral College. It's looking at popularity. And popularity doesn't win a presidential election.
I'm just talking about winning Florida. He thinks it's going to excite his base. It's going to excite folks who don't want him and his policies.
We'll see. Remember, after Hurricane Maria, a whole lot of people from Puerto Rico moved to Florida. And now that they live in Florida, they can vote.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.